Hey guys, welcome back. We're ready to start reading chapter 15, found on page 129 on your digital copy. So join me today. The days had folded one into another and mixed so that after 2 to 3 weeks he only knew time had passed in days because he had made a mark for each day in stone near the door of his shelter. Real time he measured in events. A day was nothing, not a thing to remember. It was just the sun coming up and the sun going down, some light in the middle. But events were burned into his memory, and so he used them to remember time and to know and to remember what had happened and to keep a mental journal. There had been the day of the first meet. That had been the day that he had started like the rest, up after the sun and clean the camp and then make sure there's enough wood for another night. But it was a long time of eating fish and looking for berries, and he craved more. He craved more food, heavier food, deeper food. He craved meat. He thought in the night now of meat, thought of his mother's cooking a roast, and dreamed of turkey. And one night he awakened before he had had to put wood on the fire, with his mouth making saliva and the taste of pork chops in his mouth. So real, and all in a dream, but it left him intent on getting meat. He had been working further and further out for wood, and sometimes now getting nearly a quarter mile away from camp for wood, and he saw many small animals. Squirrels were everywhere, small red ones that chattered at him and seemed to swear and jumped from limb to limb. There were so many rabbits, large gray ones with a mix of reddish fur, and smaller, fast gray ones that he only saw at dawn. The larger ones sometimes eat until he was quite close, and then bounded and jerked 2 or 3 steps before freezing again. He thought if he worked at it and practiced, he might hit one of the larger rabbits with an arrow or a spear. Never the small ones or the squirrels. They were too small and just too fast. Then there were the fool birds. They exasperated him to the point where they were close to driving him insane. The birds were everywhere, 5 and 6 feet in a flock, and then camouflage, and was so perfect that it was impossible for Brian to sit and rest, leaning against a tree, with one of them standing right in front of him in a willow clump 2 or 3 feet away, hidden only to explode into a deafening flight just when Brian at least expected it. He just couldn't see them, couldn't figure out how to locate them before they flew, because they stood so perfectly still and blended in so perfectly well. And what made it worse was that they were so dumb. They seemed to be so dumb, at least, that it almost insulting the way they kept hidden from him. Not could he get used to the way that they had exploded up when they flew. It seemed like every time he went for wood, which was every morning, he spent the whole time jumping and jerking in fright as he walked. On one memorable morning, he had actually reached for a piece of wood and thought to be a patchy stump or a base of a dead birch, his fingers close to touching it, to only have it blow up in his face. But on that day, the first meal, he had decided the best thing to try would be for a fool bird, and that morning he had set out with his bow and spear to get one, to stay with it until he got one and ate some meat. Not to get wood, not to find berries, but to get a bird and eat some meat. At first the hunt had not gone so well. He saw plenty of birds working up along the shore of the lake to the end and then down the other side, but he only saw them after they flew. He had to find a way to see them first, to see them and to get close enough to shoot them with the bow or use the spear, and not find a way to see them. When he had gone halfway around the lake and had jumped up 20 or so birds, he finally gave up and sat at the base of the tree. He had to work this out and to see what he was doing wrong. There were birds there, and he had eyes. He just had to bridge the two together. Looking wrong, he thought. I'm looking wrong. More and more than I'm just being wrong somehow. I'm doing it in the wrong way. Fine, sarcasm came into his thoughts. I know that, thank you very much. I know that I'm doing it wrong, but what is right? The morning sun had cooked him until it seemed like his brain was frying, sitting by a tree, but nothing came until he got up and started to walk out, and he hadn't gone 2 steps when a bird got up. It had been there the whole time, while he was thinking about how to see them, next to him, right there. He almost screamed. But this time when the bird flew, something caught his eye, and it was the secret key. The bird cut down toward the lake, and then when seeing it he couldn't land in the water, turned back and flew up the hill into the trees. When it turned, curving through the trees, the sun caught it, and Brian for an instant saw that it was the shape, a sharp pointed in the front, back from the head in a streamlined bullet shape to fat body. Kind of like a pear, he thought, with a point on one end and a fat little body, flying pear. That had been the secret. He had been looking for feathers for the color of the bird, for a bird sitting there, and it took him for almost outline. Instead, he had to see the shape instead of the feathers or the color, had to train his eyes to see the shape. It was like turning on a television. Suddenly he could see things that he had never seen before. In just moments it seemed that he saw 3 birds before they flew, saw them sitting, and got close to one of them. Moving slowly, got close enough to try to take a shot with a bow. He missed that time, and he had missed many times more, but he saw them, and he saw the little fat shapes with pointed heads sitting in the brush over the place. Time and again he drew and held and let arrows fly, but he still had no feathers on the arrow, and there had been a little more than sticks that had flopped out of the bow, sometimes going sideways. Even when a bird was 7 or 8 feet away, the arrow would turn without feathers to stabilize it, hit the brush or a twig. After a time he gave up with the bow. It had worked all right for the fish, but when they came to the end of the arrow, it wasn't good for any kind of distance. At least, not the way it was now. But he had carried his fish spear, the original one with the 2 prongs, and he moved the bow to the left hand and carried the spear in his right. He tried throwing the spear, but he was not a good shot. Not enough, or not fast enough. The birds could fly amazingly fast, get up fast, but in the end he found that he saw the bird sitting and moved sideways toward it, not directly toward it, but at an angle back and forth. He could get close enough to put the spear point head almost to the bird and thrust and lunge with it. He came close twice, and then down along the lake, not far from the beaver house, he got his first meat. The bird had sat and he had lunged, and the 2 points took the bird back down into the ground and killed it almost instantly. It had fluttered a bit, and Brian had grabbed it and held it in both hands until he was sure that it was dead. Then he picked up the spear and the bow and trotted back down the lake to the shelter, where the fire had burned down to growing coals. He sat looking at the bird, wondering what to do. With the fish, he had just cooked them whole and left everything in and picked the meat off. This was different. He would have to clean it. It had always been so simple at home. He would go to the store and get a chicken, and it was all clean and neat, no feathers or insides, and his mother would bake it in the oven, and he would eat it. His mother, from time to time would bake it. Now he had the bird, but he had never cleaned one, never taken the insides or gotten rid of the feathers, and he didn't know where to start. But he wanted the meat, and he had to have the meat. That's what drove him. In the end, the feathers came off pretty easy. He tried to pluck them out, but the skin was so fragile that it pulled off as well. So he pulled the skin off the bird, like peeling an orange, and thought, sort of, except that when the skin was gone, the insides fell out and the back end. He was completely caught up in a cloud of raw odor and kind of a steamy dung odor that it came up from the greasy coil of the insides that fell from the bird that he nearly threw up. But there was something else to the smell as well, some kind of richness that went with his hunger that overcame the sick smell. He quickly cut off the neck with his hatchet and cut the feet off the same way. In his hand he held something like a small chicken with a dark, fat, thick breast and small legs. He set it up on some sticks on the shelter wall and took the feathers inside down to the water in his fish pond. The fish would eat them, or eat what they could, and the feeding action would bring more fish. On a second thought, he took out the wing and the tail feathers, which were still long and pretty, banded them and speckled in browns and grays and light reds. There might be some use for them, he thought. Maybe work them into the arrow somehow. The rest he threw in the water and saw the small round fish begin tearing at it, washing his hands, and back at the shelter, and the flies were on the meat. He brushed them off, and it was amazing how fast they came when he built up the fire, and the smoke increased. The flies almost magically disappeared. He pushed a pointed stick through the bird and held it over the fire. The fire was too hot, and the flames hit the fat, and the bird almost ignited. He held it higher, but the heat was worse, and finally he moved it to the side a bit, and there it seemed to cook properly, except that it only cooked on one side, and all the juices dripped out. He had to rotate it slowly, and that was hard to do with his hands, so he found a forked stick and stuck it in the sands to put his cooking stick in. He turned it in this way and found a proper method to cook the bird. In minutes the outside was cooked, and the odor came up. Was almost the same odor when his mother baked chickens in the oven, and he didn't think he could stand it. But when he tried to pull a piece of the breast meat off, the meat was still raw inside. Patience, he thought. So much of this was patience, waiting and thinking and doing things right. So much of all this, so much of all living was patience and thinking. He settled back, turning the bird slowly, letting the juices come back into the meat and letting it cook, and the smell and cook. And there came a time when it didn't matter if the meat was done or not. It was all black on the outside, hard and hot, and he would eat it. He tore a piece from the breast, a sliver of meat, and put it in his mouth and chewed carefully. Chewed as slowly and carefully as if he could not get all the taste, and thought, never in all the food, in all the hamburgers, malts, all the fries or meals at home, never in the candy store or the pies or the cakes, never in all the roasts or steaks or pizzas, never in all the submarine sandwiches, never had he tasted anything as fine as his first bite, his first meat. So this is a big turning point again in the story, because he's been eating fish and raspberries, and I don't know about you, but I would get tired of eating the same thing over and over and over. So now he kind of has a full bird, which I suppose probably tastes like chicken. So we'll find out what's going to happen next in chapter 16. So you can follow me along for the next chapter on page 138.